Who could have envisioned the surreal stillness that gripped the American coastline in the spring of 2025? It wasn't the result of a coordinated labor strike, a natural disaster, or a sudden economic crash. Instead, it was a graveyard of ambition. Thousands upon thousands of pristine, precision-engineered BMWs, Mercedes-Benzes, and Audis sitting motionless at major U.S. ports. Engines dormant, interiors smelling of fresh leather, doors locked, bound for showrooms that would never see them. These weren't abandoned relics. They were frozen assets, paralyzed by a single signature applied to a document thousands of miles away in the Oval Office. On March 15th, President Trump signed an executive order that effectively declared war on the global automotive status quo, imposing a 25% tariff on every imported car and light truck crossing into the United States. The political rhetoric was as sharp as it was powerful. Protect the American worker, revive the Rust Belt, and force foreign conglomerates to pay for the privilege of the American market. But the reality that followed was a masterclass in unintended consequences. Within a mere 72 hours, the industrial machinery began to seize. BMW immediately froze a $2.6 billion expansion of its Spartanburg facility. Mercedes-Benz halted high-value shipments in mid-transit. Audi went further, cutting off the American pipeline entirely. As 2,500 domestic parts suppliers hit the panic button, a haunting question emerged. Was this a restoration of American greatness, or the starting gun for a silent industrial exodus? To understand why the math of protectionism failed so quickly, you have to look at the numbers that politicians rarely mention. For decades, the public has been fed a binary choice: domestic versus foreign. But in the 21st century, that distinction is a phantom. Take BMW's Spartanburg plant in South Carolina. Since 1994, it has been a cornerstone of the American economy, supporting 43,000 jobs and exporting more vehicles by value than any other plant in the country. On paper, it is an American success story. But beneath the hood of an American-built BMW X5 or X7 lies a complex global DNA. Over 60% of the components in these vehicles are not American. They are the products of an intricate web of trade: high-performance engines from Germany, transmission systems from Mexico, and advanced electronic control units from Canada. The 25% tariff didn't just hit the foreign car, it hit the American car in the heart of its assembly line. Every battery module, every steering chip, and every brake sensor crossing the border was suddenly 25% more expensive. The supply chain didn't just bend, it broke. In Tuscaloosa, Alabama, Mercedes-Benz faced the same nightmare. Their high-end GLE and Maybach lines, the pinnacle of luxury, depend on a choreography of global parts. When the tax is applied to the individual ingredients, the price of the final product doesn't just rise, it explodes. Industry analysts watched in real time as production costs for Alabama and South Carolina made SUVs spiked by an average of $8,000 to $12,000 per vehicle almost overnight. For Mercedes, the choices were both toxic: eat the loss and devastate the balance sheet, or raise prices and watch the American consumer walk away. But for Audi, even those grim options weren't available. Unlike its German rivals, Audi has no massive manufacturing footprint on U.S. soil. Every Q5, Q7, and A4 is a direct import. Once you layer a 25% tariff on top of logistics, shipping, and state-level taxes, the price of a standard Audi Q7, previously $65,000, skyrocketed toward $80,000. At that price point, the psychological threshold of the buyer is shattered. American luxury consumers didn't wait for the trade war to end. They pivoted. They turned to tariff-free alternatives like the Cadillac Escalade or the Lincoln Navigator, vehicles of similar prestige and scale that carried no trade penalty. Within 14 days, Audi signaled a tactical retreat, halting all new deliveries to the U.S. They weren't just losing a market, they were being priced out of existence by a policy that claimed to be helping them. The collapse didn't stop at the dealership doors. It began to bleed into the heartland. From the industrial corridors of Michigan to the tech hubs of Texas, American suppliers who built the leather seats, the infotainment screens, and the steering modules for German brands saw their orders vanish. Layoffs that began as quiet whispers in HR offices soon became front-page news. The American auto industry estimated a staggering $45 billion in lost production value within the first year alone. Ironically, the Big Three in Detroit weren't spared. Ford reported an unexpected $1.5 billion loss as the cost of imported specialized components, the very ones they couldn't source domestically, surged. General Motors was forced to admit that 40% of its high-tech systems and battery materials were still tied to Asian and Mexican supply chains. Protectionism works in a world of simple machines, but modern cars are among the most complex consumer products ever built. In Greer, South Carolina, the impact became personal. Local engineers, men and women who had spent 20 years building the American dream for a German brand, found themselves redundant. "I have 2 kids in college," one engineer told the local press, "and my company just cut 30% of the staff because BMW orders are down 60%. This wasn't a victory. It was a localized depression. But while Washington was busy declaring a short-term political victory, the German automakers were already playing a different game, and they were moving their pieces to the east. This is the part of the story that should keep Detroit awake at night. In April 2025, Mercedes-Benz didn't unveil its next-generation EV architecture in Stuttgart or Detroit. It chose Shanghai. Shortly after, they announced a nearly $3 billion research center in Shenzhen, the undisputed Silicon Valley of battery technology. BMW followed with a massive production hub in Chengdu, boasting a capacity of 300,000 vehicles, nearly doubling what they ever produced in South Carolina. This wasn't a fit of pique or a retaliatory tantrum. It was a long-term strategic realignment. Audi began deep-tier partnerships with Chinese tech giants to develop AI-driven software and digital mapping, innovation that used to happen exclusively in the West. By closing the door to the U.S., Washington didn't force these companies to build more in America. It forced them to find a more welcoming future elsewhere. When the standards for fast charging, autonomous driving, and vehicle connectivity are set in Asia, the entire world, including Detroit, will eventually have to follow those rules. The atmosphere in these new eastern hubs couldn't look more different from the anxious streets of Alabama. In Chengdu, thousands of young, brilliant engineers are lining up to join the German R&D teams. German engineers are relocating their families to Shenzhen, not to teach, but to collaborate. A 28-year-old software developer in Shanghai summarized the shift with chilling clarity. 5 years ago, we looked to the West for the blueprint. Now, the West comes here to see how we've already built the future of the electric vehicle. This is the repeat of a historical tragedy. In the 1980s, American automakers believed that protectionist walls would save them from the rising tide of Japanese innovation. Instead, Toyota and Honda used that time to perfect quality and efficiency, eventually dominating the market not through price, but through superior value. In 2025, we are making the same mistake, but at a velocity that is 10 times faster. A 25% tariff provides a momentary high for a political campaign, but it cannot stop the global migration of capital and talent. BMW, Mercedes, and Audi aren't going to disappear from the American landscape tomorrow. They are too big for that. But they are executing 15-year strategies that redirect the brain of the industry away from the United States. American consumers are left with fewer choices and higher prices. American workers are left with instability. And American automakers are losing the very competitive pressure that forces them to innovate. As Europe adapts and Asia accelerates, the United States is at risk of becoming an industrial island, isolated by its own walls, while the rest of the world builds a faster, smarter highway. The final question isn't whether the German brands will ever come back to the level they were before. The question is this: when the dust settles, and America realizes that the future of mobility has already moved on, what will Detroit have left to offer a world that no longer needs its permission to drive forward? The engines in the ports are cold, but the factories in the east are just warming up.